There's another issue that I'm interested in. Last year, Congress enacted the American, let's see, let me get into another one here. I was fortunate enough to spend several years as the chairman and the ranking member of a committee in Congress called the Environment and Public Works Committee. It has a very large jurisdiction. It's a committee that deals with, just as the title infers, environment and public works, environmental, some of the over-regulations that we've had that have created real serious problems. And also, we've been successful in passing a lot of the initiatives, such as the FAST Act. That was the largest transportation reauthorization bill since 1998. So we have done a lot of good things there. And one of the problems that we've had that we've dealt with in that committee and will continue under the chairmanship of Senator Barrasso is to do something about the overregulation. This has been a serious problem. Mr. President, in 2.5 months between the presidential election and Inauguration Day, the Obama administration produced over 200 rulemakings, 41 of which are considered economically significant rules that will result in $100 million or more in annual costs. Now, over the course of his administration, President Obama added 481 economically significant regulations to the Federal Register, over 100 more than the Bush or the Clinton administration. Regulations cost our citizens at the current time $1.89 trillion a year and more than 580 million hours of paperwork in order to comply with this staggering amount of rules. People don't realize the cost of rules when they made such an effort starting way back in 2002 to pass legislation that was aimed at trying to get into some type of an arrangement on global warming and all of this to restrict emissions. They didn't realize that at that time, until the bills got on the floor, that the cost to such cap and trade type of regulations is between $300 and $400 billion a year to the American people. And every time I see a large figure, I'm coming from Oklahoma, I get the latest figures from Oklahoma in terms of what has happened economically in the previous year. And those regulations would cost the average family in my state of Oklahoma that pays federal income tax an addition of $3,000 a year. And by their own admission, it wouldn't accomplish anything. I can remember, as chairman of that committee, we had Lisa Jackson. Lisa Jackson was the director of the EPA, the first one that President Obama had appointed. And I asked her the question live on TV in an open meeting. I said, if we were to pass either by regulation or by legislation, the cap and trade legislation that they're talking about passing and have been talking about, would this reduce CO2 emissions worldwide? Her answer, no, it wouldn't, because this isn't where the problem is. So if it's not going to accomplish something, even if you believe that the world's coming to an end because of fossil fuels, it still is, if this doing something in the United States is not going to correct it. But that's the cost of rules, and that's what we're looking at right now. We went through 481 significant regulations during the Obama administration. Now, at the last minute, after President Obama realized that Hillary Clinton was not going to win, he got involved in what we refer to as midnight regulations. And he had several of these midnight regulations, last-minute regulations. He's trying to get in after the election took place, and we knew who was going to be the next president, but before the next president took office. One of such a midnight regulation finalized on January 13th is the Environmental Protection Agency's rule entitled The Accidental Release Prevention Requirements Risk Management Programs under the Clean Air Act. That's the title. EPA states that the purpose of the updated rule is to improve safety at facilities that use and distribute hazardous chemicals. And as you can imagine, environmentalists will not be happy if this rule is changed, but I argue that this rule does not make facilities or surrounding communities safer. In fact, it could put them at greater risk. There are several concerns with this rule, but the biggest one is the national security implications due to the rule's public disclosure requirements. Under this rule, the facilities are required to share information on the types of chemicals stored there and the security vulnerabilities with emergency responders and upon request to the general public. Now, the rule does not provide for the protection of this information from further disclosure once it's provided. It is well known that terrorists have considered attacks on chemical facilities as a way to kill citizens and cause mass destruction of our communities. And of course, requiring the disclosure of this information to anyone who asks is very reckless and impossible to understand. We can't figure out why they would do that. In fact, Congress, the terrorists would have access to the same information, which would make their job a lot easier. Congress has passed several bills to protect just this kind of information, and I was even the author of one of these bills. Under the Chemical Safety Information Site Security and Fields Regulatory Relief Act of 1999, the distribution of sensitive information from chemical facilities is limited to publicly available federal reading rooms and certain federal, state, and local officials and researchers who are then barred from further disseminating the information. Now, this makes sense. We need local officials to know what they should do in the event there's a problem. But our enemies should not be able to get this information. It's fine, except you don't want to give it to our enemies, those who are in the terrorist community. But the new rule by the EPA does not provide any of these protections to the information now required to be shared upon request, to include audit reports, exercise schedules, and summaries, and emergency response details, all of which would provide those intent on criminal acts with a blueprint of facility and emergency response vulnerabilities. This is exactly what they want to perform their terrorist activities. The requirement does not make these facilities safer, but actually increases the chance of harm to be done to them. The sole reason that this rule was updated by the Obama administration stems from the West Texas chemical plant explosion of 2013. Yet this rule on accidental release prevention would do nothing to prevent another West Texas, because that explosion and the fire was intentional. It was an act of arson. The Obama administration used this tragedy that took 15 lives as an excuse to make these facilities and surrounding communities less safe, and it just doesn't make sense. Unless you look at what else the rule does, this rule is the first step in EPA expanding its authority under the Clean Air Act to mandate how chemicals are manufactured and used. You know, we just passed a bill on a bipartisan basis that takes care of this problem. You don't have to worry about that anymore. The EPA is requiring paper, petroleum, coal, and chemical manufacturing industries to conduct safer technology and alternative analyses. That's called STAA as part of their process hazard analysis. In conducting this STAA, these industries must consider what they call inherently safer technologies or inherently safer designs. Now, this sounds good, but it's something it's so ambiguous. Nobody knows what the real definition is. And while the rule stops short of requiring EPA's approval of these STAAs or requiring the implementation of IST and ISDs, it is only a matter of time before the environmental groups begin to litigate the issue and ask activist courts to force EPA to mandate these measures. And this is the proverbial camel's nose under the tent. Industry will tell you that the best time to assess inherently safer technologies and designs is during the initial design phase. Furthermore, industries are constantly evaluating their processes and making changes as the margins based on what works best for the products and customers. Allowing the EPA to become a part of that conversation adds a third party to the question that does not care about the company, the products, or the consumers. The inherent safety of a technology or design is a relative standard, and what might be safer in one company or product does not mean it's going to be safer within a process that is completely different in a different company. For example, it may be inherently safe to store or use less of a hazardous material, but that would likely increase the number of shutdowns and startups due to not having enough materials at hand. Research shows that the shutting down and restarting of chemical processes poses a greater risk than continuous operation would. Additionally, you would increase deliveries and movements of hazardous material throughout the surrounding communities, shifting the risk elsewhere. And how can we say definitely that is safer? So as you can see, there's no definitive answer to what would be inherently safer. It's an ambiguous term that means it's very difficult to define. And allowing the EPA's foot in the door on this would only lead to a heavier-handed mandate that would hurt industries, consumers, and jobs, and ultimately the buying public. This rule was promulgated on the premise of preventing another West Texas tragedy, but this rule does nothing to protect facilities from intentional actions of a criminal or of a terrorist, and in fact would actually have be in a position to aid them in their quest to do us harm. So, Mr. President, I've only outlined a couple of the many concerns that this rule it creates, and I believe that we should take a look at what this actually does. Now, it's not just this rule, because as I said, the President went in, at that time, President Obama went in at the last minute and did these midnight rules. And again, this is one of the things that we can look forward to, doing away with some of the over-regulations that has cost the Americans so much over the last 8 years. With that, I will yield the floor.
Mr. President?
Senator from Pennsylvania.